She handed him the keys like she was tossing out the trash. 200 donors watched her do it. "Consider it a tip," she said, loud enough for the cameras. "Maybe you can use it for parts." The crowd laughed. He didn't. Behind her, wrapped in a stained tarp, sat a rusted shell with no engine and no name. Nobody in that ballroom knew what they were looking at. He did. What he saw in that ruined fender would be worth $9 million by morning. The morning started the way it always did, with 6 small shoes lined up against the wall by the front door. Smallest to largest, toes pointed the same direction, like a tiny parade waiting for permission to leave. Lily stood over them in her socks, frowning with the seriousness of a surgeon, nudging the left sneaker a half-inch to the right until it matched its twin. "Dad, is today a good shoes day or a bad shoes day?" Daniel Pierce looked up from the coffee maker, which was hissing through its 3rd attempt at brewing anything resembling coffee. "What's the difference? Good shoes days, nothing bad happens. Bad shoes days, something bad happens. But then something good happens after, so it's okay." He considered this with the gravity it deserved. "I think today's a good shoes day. You always say that." "That's because it's always true." He set a bowl of cereal in front of her, and she pulled Pepper, a stuffed rabbit with one ear permanently folded down from years of being slept on, into the chair beside her, propping him up against the napkin holder so he could watch. It was a small kitchen in a small house, and everything in it had a worn, dependable quality, the kind of furniture that had given up trying to look new decades ago, and had settled instead into being simply useful. The only thing in the room that didn't belong was bolted to the wall above the stove, a faded photograph in a plain wood frame, showing a much younger Daniel kneeling beside the open hood of a car that gleamed like poured silver, his hands black with grease, grinning at someone behind the camera. Lily had asked about the photo more times than she could count, and the answer never changed. "That was a long time ago, before you. Were you fixing it?" "I was making sure it was perfect." There's a difference. What she didn't know, what she was too young to be told, and what Daniel had no interest in explaining over cereal, was that the man in that photograph had spent 11 years inside the climate-controlled garages of one of the most exclusive private car collections in the world. The kind of place where a single fender was insured for more than most people's houses. He had learned to read metal the way some people read faces. The hammer marks, the seam lines, the tiny inconsistencies that told you not just what a car was, but who had built it, and when, and sometimes even why. He had left all of it 3 years ago, in the space of about 6 weeks after his wife Margaret's diagnosis turned from something they were fighting into something they were losing. The collection's owner had been generous, more generous than Daniel had expected, offering an open door back whenever he was ready. Daniel had thanked him and never called. There was a 5-year-old who needed someone to walk her to school, and there was no version of that job that allowed for it. So now he ran a one-bay shop on the edge of town, doing oil changes and brake jobs, and the occasional restoration for a local enthusiast. And the photograph stayed on the wall not because he missed it, but because Lily liked it, and because some things you keep not for yourself. The only physical reminder he kept from that old life was a small leather roll of hand tools, a set of precision scribes and calipers, German-made, that had belonged to his mentor. He didn't use them often, but he kept the roll in the bottom drawer of his workbench, oiled and wrapped, the way some men keep a watch that no longer runs. Across town, in a glass tower that caught the morning light like a blade, Vanessa Hale was already on her 3rd call of the day, standing at a window 40 floors above a city that, from this height, looked less like a place where people lived and more like a circuit board. Hale Capital occupied the top 6 floors of the building. Vanessa had occupied the corner office for 2 years. Ever since her father's death had moved her from here to chief executive in the space of a single board meeting. She was 33, and she had inherited not just the company but the particular weather system that surrounded people who Had never, not once, had to wait for anything. Reservations existed for her. Doors opened before she reached them. When she walked into a room, the room rearranged itself around her without being asked. This week, the rearranging was for the Hale Foundation Gala, an annual black tie fundraiser held in her father's name, raising money for pediatric research, attended by the kind of donors who measured their philanthropy in the size of the headline it generated. It was, everyone agreed, going to be the biggest one yet. There would be press, there would be a memorial tribute, and buried in storage beneath the foundation's offices, gathering dust under a stained canvas tarp, exactly where it had sat since her father's death, was a wrecked, engineless 1938 Talbot Lago that her father had bought decades ago and never finished restoring. Vanessa had walked past it 100 times without a second look. To her, it was a rust-colored eyesore taking up space that could be used for filing cabinets. Her assistant had floated the idea of finally hauling it to scrap, and Vanessa, mid-thought about something else entirely, had said the words that would change everything without giving them a second thought. Actually, give it to the mechanic, the one doing the gala car detailing. Make it a bit, it'll be funny. She had no idea what was sitting under that tarp. She had even less idea who was about to walk into her ballroom to look at it. The Hale Foundation Gala was held in a ballroom that had been built a century earlier for exactly this kind of evening. Soaring ceilings strung with chandeliers, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, and enough gold leaf on the walls to make a museum curator wince. By 7 that evening, it was filled with 200 of the city's wealthiest people, dressed in the kind of clothes that existed purely to be photographed, moving through the room in slow orbits around ice sculptures and champagne towers. Daniel had been hired 3 days earlier through a referral, a small detailing job, nothing more. The foundation wanted the antique cars in their private collection, cleaned and presented in the lobby for donors to admire on their way in. A tasteful nod to the family's history with classic automobiles. He'd spent 2 days in the foundation's underground garage with a respirator and a bucket, working alone, bringing decades-old paint back to something resembling a shine. It was easy, honest work, and it paid well, and nobody had so much as glanced at him the entire time. Tonight he'd been asked to stay late. There was apparently one more car that needed to be moved out of storage and into the lobby for a brief unveiling. He'd put on the only blazer he owned over his work shirt, because that was what the email had said to do. And now he stood near the edge of the lobby, in a room full of people who had never once, in their lives, worn the same shoes 2 days running. He noticed Lily wasn't with him. She was at her grandmother's for the night, and was glad of it, until the moment he realized he wasn't glad of it at all, because right now he would have given anything to have her small hand in his. The one more car arrived on a flatbed, wrapped in a stained gray tarp, and was wheeled to a spot near the center of the lobby, close enough to the ballroom doors that anyone walking in would pass directly by it. A small crowd had already gathered, drawn by the spectacle of a tarp-covered shape being unveiled. The way crowds are always drawn to things that might be embarrassing for someone. Vanessa Hale arrived at the unveiling, flanked by 2 members of her PR team and a photographer who had been quietly instructed 20 minutes earlier that something fun was about to happen and to be ready for it. She wore a suit the color of wet slate, cut so precisely it looked less like clothing and more like architecture. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a way that made every angle of her face look deliberate. She held a flute of champagne she had no intention of drinking, and she scanned the small crowd until she found the man in the slightly too large blazer standing near the foundation's logistics coordinator, the mechanic. She'd been told, the one who'd been crawling around the garage all week. She'd never seen him before in her life. It took her less than 2 seconds to decide everything she needed to know. "You're the detail guy," she said. Not a question. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Pierce." "Right." She turned to the small crowd, raising her voice slightly. The practiced lift of someone used to being listened to. So, funny story. We were clearing out some old storage, found this thing my dad bought 1,000,000 years ago, never even got around to it. Total wreck. And I thought, she gestured at the tarp, then at Daniel, with a smile that invited everyone in on the joke. Well, Daniel here's been doing such a great job on the real cars all week. I figured this could be his, like a tip. A pause perfectly timed. Consider it a tip, she said again, louder this time, for the people in the back. Maybe you can use it for parts. The crowd laughed. A warm, easy laugh. The kind that comes from people who are relieved to be told what's funny. A few applauded. Someone near the back said, "God, Vanessa, you're terrible," in a tone that meant exactly the opposite. Daniel did not laugh. He didn't flinch, either. He stood very still, the way a man stands when he has been handed something he wasn't expecting and hasn't yet decided what it is. His eyes moved past Vanessa entirely, past the crowd, past the photographer already lifting his camera, and went to the tarp. The foundation coordinator,